truly shines when it comes to setting up a server. Beautiful. We're done with our basic example. Now let's tackle the big beast, our navbar app. And the setup for the following examples is really up to you. If you're not a fan of retyping something you have already learned, you don't have to do that. You can just remove app.get all the way to app.all. So basically, leave the import as well as instantiation and listen as well. However, I am a fan of repeating something because that way, whenever I need to create something from the scratch, I already have done it quite a few times. So I don't have that blank page syndrome where you're like looking at the empty file and you don't know what to do. So in my case, I'm going to remove everything and we'll start from the scratch. So const express is equal to require. And of course, we're looking for express. And then I'm going to set up my app that is equal to express. We invoke it. And again, we go with app.listen and we're going to go with 5,000. Now, I'm not saying that I'm going to do that for every example, but I'm just showcasing what is my approach when I'm starting something new. So when I'm learning something new, yes, I do like to retype some of the stuff quite a few times because that just makes sure that I remember it better. And in here, I'm going to go with server is listening on port, and we go with 5,000 and then dot, dot, dot. And in order to set everything up, we're going to go with app.get. So again, I'm looking for the root. And of course, I would want to start with my index.html, correct? That's the start. And we go with app.get. So we're listening for all the incoming requests that go to our root. And of course, we're specifically listening for get requests. Then we have our callback function, rec and res. And we'll set up the functionality in a second. Before we do anything, let's also set up all. And this is, of course, going to be for all the requests that will hit 404. So we're going to go with rec and res. And here, let's say res and then status. So let's add here a 200, or I'm sorry, 404. My bad. And then we're going to go with send. And inside of the send, let's just go with resource not found. Now, when it comes to get, in this case, I would want to send the file. More specifically, I would want to send back the index.html. And in order to do that, I need to use send file method that comes with express. Now in there though, I do need to provide a absolute path. So we'll have to use one of the modules we covered before, and that is going to be a path module. So I go with const path is equal to require, and I'm looking for path module. Again, we don't have to install it. It comes pre-installed with Node, so we are in good shape. And then where we have our callback function, we go with res and send file method. And here, let's pass in path and then resolve. So path dot resolve, remember, that was one of the methods we cover. And effectively, I would want to pass in the dir name. So this is going to be path to our directory because we do need to provide that absolute path. And then, of course, we're looking for our index.html, which is sitting in the navbar app. So / and then navbar - app. And then we have another / index.html. Now, if I have to be perfectly honest, in this case, we can also use path.join. It doesn't really matter since their name provides that absolute path. But just to be a bit explicit that we are providing absolute path, I went with path.resolve and then the dir name and then whatever is the path to my index.html. And the moment we save it, we'll have the same errors just like in the HTTP module. So I go to my localhost 5000 and I still have the same issues. I still don't have style CSS. There's no sign of browser app as well as the logo. Now in Express though, we don't have to do this whole song and dance like in HTTP module. In Express, I can simply go above all my app.gets and app.alls, and I can go with app.use. And this is going to be the case where I'll type out the code and then I'll explain everything that is happening. And we'll pass in the express. So this is what we're importing. So this is not going to be our server instance. Instead, we're going to go with express and then static. That's the method. And in here, again, we just need to provide a path. Now, common name is setting this up as the folder by the name of public. Please keep in mind, technically, you don't have to do that. You can just point to our navbar app. But in my case, I will do that. I will set up here dot / and I'll call this public. So now, of course, what I need is to set up a folder by the name of public, and then all my static resources, all my static files, I would want to transfer there. Now, don't worry about it. I'll cover in length what in a server land means static resources. For now, what I would want you to do is go back to our folder, and that is going to be Express Tutorial. And of course, you can do that in Visual Studio Code. I just think that this is going to be a bit easier to see. So I'm going to create a new folder. Again, common convention is calling this public, but you can call it whatever, lobster. It doesn't really matter. And then in my case, I'm just going to copy these files. So take browser app, take logo, and take styles. If you want, you can move them. Just remember that the previous code is not going to work as far as the HTTP module setup. So I'm going to copy these ones and paste it here in my public. So now, of course, I have browser app, logo SVG, and style CSS. So, of course, now I can zoom out. And once I save, check it out. When we navigate to our root, there it is. This is our application. And what's really cool, all of those resources are right away available. So if I go to my localhost 5000, remember, browser was looking for what? Well, it was looking, for example, for style CSS. If you go here, there is a resource by the name of style CSS. And of course, in here, I have all my CSS code. And notice how we didn't have to set up the statuses. We didn't have to set up the content types or any of that. Express takes care of it all. Now, of course, you probably at this point have more questions than answers. So let me start clearing them up. And first, I'm just going to add a comment of setup static and middleware. And like I mentioned, app.use is for setting up the middleware. And we have more serious examples coming up. So for time being, please don't worry about this line. Okay, so please don't worry about app.use. What is express static? That is essentially a built-in middleware. I will cover everything step by step. In this video, I would want you to understand what the term static asset means. And it simply means that it is a file that server doesn't have to change it. So instead of our HTTP example, where we created a path for every such resource. And if I were to have, I don't know, 20,000 images, I would have to repeat the same steps. Instead, since this is a static asset, meaning an asset where the server doesn't need to change it, we simply place it in designated folder. Again, the common name for those folders are public or static. And then we just dump all those assets in there. So if I were to have, I don't know, 20,000 extra images in here, I can just dump them and Express will take care of it all. It will set up the paths, it will set up the MIME types, it will set up the status codes and all of that good stuff. So hopefully that is clear. Static assets are just files that server doesn't have to change. And an example of a static asset is an image file, is the style file, and also a JavaScript file. And here comes the next question. Well, what is this guy with weird Eastern European accent talking about? Because all my life I've been told that the JavaScript makes my apps dynamic. It adds all the functionality. So how come this is just another static asset? And to answer your question, yeah, you're right. JavaScript does make our apps dynamic. However, think about it. This is a browser app. So it makes dynamic on a browser. As far as server is concerned, It is just a asset that doesn't need to change. Now, if you're wondering, well, how to set up something dynamic, just please put the pin on that. And we're going to cover that when we cover server-side rendering, because there is such thing as template engines. And the simplest way for me to explain that is imagine the scenario where you can actually log in, or in other way, just showcase whoever is visiting the site, and then dynamically I would display, for example, name. So if the Peter logs in, then I'm sending back the HTML with the text of "Hi Peter." Now, if the John logs in, then of course I'm sending back the username with the value of John. So hopefully you get the gist. Where in this case, notice this is just same old index HTML that I'm sending back, regardless of who's visiting the site. But yes, there's also an option of setting this dynamically, where depending on who's visiting the site or what the user is trying to do, I'm actually modifying my file before I'm sending it back. So hopefully it is clear how much easier it is to work with Express, where if we have static assets, we just set up designated folder and just dump them all in. And static asset just means a file that server doesn't need to change. And of course, we can start working on our next example. Nice. Hopefully we are clear on static assets. And before we cover more complex Express topics, I would want to throw a mind grenade at you. And it goes something like this. So if we put 2 and 2 together, I talked about static assets in the previous video. But if we're looking at the index HTML, isn't this a static asset as well? And of course, the answer is yes. So instead of sending this file, we can add it to static assets and we're going to be in good shape. And if I have to be perfectly honest with you, when it comes to send file, if we're using it to send back, for example, index HTML, actually we use other 2 methods instead. So first, I'll show you the first one where we just dump everything as far as the static assets. So I'll just add index HTML to all my static assets in the public, and that will effectively do exactly the same like we're doing here with send file. And the other one is going to be using templating engine. So of course that one we'll cover when we go to server-side rendering. So I'm just trying to showcase that yes, there is this option of send file, and we might use it from time to time throughout the course, but not for sending back index HTML files. So first, let me just say that the other option, one of the 2 other options that we'll use the most throughout the course, is just adding 2 static assets like so. And then the second one is going to be server-side rendering, where basically we'll use template engine for that. So in order to set everything up, now, of course, I just need to take my index HTML. And again, if you want, you can just move it. Or in my case, I'm just going to copy and paste. So again, I'm going to go back to my folder. I'll zoom in massively so you can see better. So Express tutorial, there's my navbar app, and I'll just take the index HTML and I'll copy and paste. And now it is in the public. So what happens, index HTML is always going to be a root. So when the user hits the server, by default, server will serve this index HTML. And since our index HTML basically has all the paths to browser app, to logo SVG, and all that, we're going to be in good shape, where effectively we don't even need to set up this send file option. So now, of course, I can just save it. And once I refresh, notice how nothing changed. I'm still serving my app. So we're still in good shape. And if you take a look at the network tab, notice everything still works correctly. I'm still getting all the CSS, all the browser, JavaScript functionality, as well as the logo. And to answer your question, yes, that is effectively how you can set up the simple sites. You can simply just dump all your files in the public. Just make sure that you serve them up, and that's it. And you're in good shape. Now, we still have the 404, but as far as just serving straight up sites with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, yes, you can simply dump them in a public. You can simply set up the middleware and serve all the static assets, and you're going to be in good shape. Beautiful. We are successfully done with the initial Express setup and ready to cover more complex Express topics. Before we do that, though, there's something important I want to mention. You see, when it comes to Express, in most cases, you'll use one of the two following options. You'll use it to set up API or templates with server-side rendering. Now, since term API is probably one of the most overused terms in the community, and in various scenarios, it can mean different things, let's start by understanding that in Express or in HTTP case, when we talk about API, we mean setting up an HTTP interface to interact with our data. Now, data is sent using JSON, which stands for JavaScript Object Notation. And in order to send back our response, we're going to use res.json method, which will do all the heavy lifting, like, for example, setting up the proper content type and stringify our data. The other flavor we have is server-side rendering, where we will set up templates and send back entire HTML and CSS and JavaScript ourselves. And we're going to do that using res.render method. Now, since I'm a big believer in actual examples over slides, if you are a bit iffy on either of these flavors, just hold on a bit. And once we cover some examples, I promise you it will all make sense. Now, why am I telling you all of this? You see, when it comes to more complex Express topics, it only makes sense if we cover them properly using one of these flavors instead of just a bunch of random examples. And the option I picked is the API one. So in the following examples, we're going to construct API response using more advanced Express setups. The reason why I picked API route is because I believe it lets us focus more on the actual Express, since templates by themselves add a bit more unnecessary overhead, especially while we're just starting out with Express. With that said, let me be very clear. If you grasp the concepts with API, so using the API flavor, you'll have no problem implementing them with templates as well, since for the most part, Express concept setup is exactly the same. We'll cover server-side rendering later in the course, so you'll have to wait a bit for the actual example. And since we're going to start with API, let me just stress the main point one more time and how it looks like in a real world. So, like I said, the main idea with APIs is that our server provides data. And what that means that any front-end app that wants to access it and use it can simply perform a HTTP request and using our data, set up the API and functionality. How does that look like in a real world? Well, if you navigate again back to course API, and of course, not the slides. Slides are just images. But if you take a look at any of these examples, you'll notice something interesting where we're sending back the JSON. And you can clearly see that if you go again to your browser's network tab, and in here again, let's refresh, and you'll see that this is our response, React tabs project. So again, the full URL is courseapi.com and then React tabs project. And if we take a closer look, we can see that this is the response that we're sending. So we're sending back a JSON data. And I can clearly see that in my headers. So in the response headers, as you can see, content type is application JSON. Now, where is this data used? If you took either my React course or the vanilla JavaScript course, you know that in the course, we build quite a few projects where we practice data fetching, either using vanilla JS or React. And in some examples, we use external APIs, and in some, we use the APIs that are here in the course API. So for example, with this React tabs project, if you navigate to React project netlify.app and keep on scrolling. You'll hit the tabs project. And in here, this is the app that we build using the data. So again, on a server, I set up my data, I set up the API, and I share the data. So I create the HTTP interface, and then the front end app just simply grabs this data. And again, if you want, you can check it out here. If you refresh, notice this request. Request goes to Course API, React tabs project. So we grab the data on the front end, and then we set up the functionality as well as user interface. Hopefully this is clear. From now on, we're going to be responsible for sending back the data. So now, since we're setting up the server, it's not going to be our responsibility to do something with it like we were doing on the front end. In this case, we are responsible for setting up the responses. So we're going to be setting up APIs that are